Yes, I'm about 50 miles north of Atlanta in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, about 25 miles as the crow flies from the end of the Appalachian Trail. Kind of hilly up here, and if I walk down to the creek, it's pretty steep.
Nice. And is that where you grew up? Did you grow up in that part of Georgia?
Not too far away, a little bit closer to Athens, Georgia, where
Mm.
the University of Georgia is. I grew up on a farm there.
Hmm. So I guess you're a Georgia Bulldogs fan.
Oh, yeah. My uncle, my mother's brother, played football there for Georgia in the 1928 to 30 time frame when they actually built and dedicated Sanford Stadium. And his sons played in the early 50s when I was a little kid, and I would go over and watch them practice. And I always felt like I was going to be the quarterback for the Georgia Bulldogs.
Hmm.
But my senior year in high school, I was the quarterback, but I wasn't the fastest guy on the team, and I only weighed 155 pounds. And I decided there was something else I was supposed to do in life.
Yeah. So what did you do instead of quarterbacking the Bulldogs?
I went to the University of Georgia, and I started out in pre-med, and I wasn't a good student. I was probably the worst student that ever graduated in 4 years. But you had to be, back then, those days, state universities, you had to be in ROTC for 2 years. And I was in Air Force ROTC. Now, when I was 6 years old, my parents had visited. We went picnicking one Sunday afternoon down in Athens at the Veterans Park. And they had a World War II fighter plane there. My dad picked me up and set me on the wing. And I went over and looked in that canopy and looked in that, and I thought, this is me. And from then on, I started thinking about being a flyer, a fighter pilot. And so I got in ROTC and I passed all the tests. And by the time I graduated, they had a flight indoctrination program. By the time I graduated and got my degree, uh, I had a private pilot's license because the Air Force had some screening training there. And so I was a pilot when I graduated. I said I was the worst student that graduated, probably lowest grade GPA, but in Air Force ROTC, I was a distinguished graduate and number two in my class. So
Wow.
I think I didn't know how to study, I didn't know how to focus, and I could get by, and that was it. But later in the POW camps, I learned to focus.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll bet you did. So you got your commission coming out of the University of Georgia?
Yes, so I had finished my last class, and they swore me in 3 days later because flight school at Valdosta at Moody Air Force Base started the next week, and I went straight down there. 53 weeks later, I got my
Sorry. What year was this that you finished up at
okay,
Georgia?
yeah, University of Georgia, 1965. I
Class
graduated
of 65.
school in 61, college in 65, and in July, I got commissioned and headed to Valdosta, Georgia, which is about 4 hours south of Athens, 4.5 hours south. Valdosta is right just near the Florida line. It's in flatland country down there, swampy country. Great
Mhm.
place to fly back then. And so, uh, 53 weeks later, I got my wings. My class graduated, and uh, half of our class, because this was August 1966, the Vietnam War is building up. Half of our class got an assignment that said F-4 Phantom pipeline Southeast Asia, which meant as quick as we could get through the replacement training unit, the RTU, which was combat qualified in the F-4, we would be going to the war. And no stateside basing for us once we got through our combat training. And there were about three bases that trained F-4 pilots for the combat and to be qualified. And I went to the one in Southern California near Apple Valley, about 40 miles east of Edwards Air Force Base, which is where the Edwards test is there in the high desert of California. You know, it was great flying. We did everything they did in Top Gun, about 100 miles south of where they filmed Top Gun. Plus, we did air to ground, air to air. In the first one, they did just air to air, and the second one, they did air to ground, but we did them all. And we even did some combat training, and we'd run into some Navy pilots and we'd get in a dogfight with them. So it was fun, but we knew that when we finished our training, we were headed to war, and that's what happened.
Yeah, I was about to get serious. Now, when you were at the University of Georgia, you said in state schools, if you went to a state school, you had to do 2 years of ROTC. That's the first I've heard of that.
That was a national law. that if you went to a government-funded university, you had to have 2 years of ROTC. And it could
Okay.
be Army, it could be Air Force, it could be uh, Navy at some bases. Some schools had Navy. Most of them didn't, but a few of them did. Like Duke University had Navy, but the University of Georgia just had Army and Air Force. And on and our we had so therefore we had over 1,100 people in ROTC Cadet Corps. And every year there were probably 60 or 70 getting commissioned. But the first freshmen and sophomores, all the male freshmen and sophomores had to have 2 years of ROTC. So we'd be out there marching once a week. We'd be out marching and went to class twice a week and marched once a week.
Yeah, I guess what I'm wondering is if you mentioned that once you were in Valdosta and then out in California, that looming sense of Vietnam was starting. And I
Yeah.
just wonder when you were in ROTC, just because it's military and you were there in between 61 and 65, had Vietnam occurred to you at that point, or
Oh
was
yeah.
it?
Oh yeah. It Other things had occurred. When uh, Kennedy was assassinated, we didn't know if we might go to war, but especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that's when I was about a sophomore, junior. I wasn't able to get a commission, and I was already decided I was going to either join the Marine Corps, and because they were going to drafting. See, back
Mm,
then, every male got drafted if they physically passed the physical. Every
mm,
male. 18, they're going to, unless you're in college, and they would delay it until you graduated, but everybody went in the military. Every male went in the military back then.
yeah.
So being in the ROTC wasn't a big deal. We knew we were going to have to go in the military when we graduated. And so it was happening then and building up every year. I was a senior in 65, and that's when we really started to get involved. And that's when the guys started getting shot down over North Vietnam. We started really bombing North Vietnam in 65, and that's when guys started to get shot down. So we were hearing about that. But when you're a pilot, you believe in yourself, and that happened to somebody else, it won't happen to me.
I see. Yeah. Yeah. I hear that a lot from pilots. What
Yeah.
did one guy call himself? He said, uh, oblivious and what was the other thing? Oblivious and I can't remember. It'll come to me. But I hear that a lot. I've talked the pilots I talk to all say they felt invulnerable.
You have to believe in yourself. And we'll talk about that later when we get into POW camps, but you
Sure,
have to
sure.
believe in yourself. And I felt very comfortable in flying fighters, and I just felt like that's where I was supposed to be. You
Hmm.
know, it was where I was
So,
supposed to be, and the people around me felt the same way. And we were very competitive with each other, but the thing about fighter pilots, or pilots really in general in the military, is you brief for your flight, you go out and do it. Let's say you're going to go drop bombs or go to air practice. And when you come back, you have to debrief and you go over everything that went well, and especially the things that didn't go well, and how we can do them better next time.
mhm.
You have to come back in, you take off your equipment, hang it up, and you go into the room, you get a cup of coffee or Coke or something, and you go sit down and you debrief, and you have a whiteboard there and you can draw on it. And you it's really important. It's a great way to learn to decompress, to debrief what went well and what went wrong. Most people can't handle that in the workshop today, in a workplace today, but it's really a healthy thing. And some of the fighter pilots are out teaching now business places how to debrief.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I imagine that in a situation like that, you're looking for less for blame and who's at fault and why
Right.
something went wrong and more for what you can learn from it and how to avoid it in the future.
You're
That's
always,
not corporate culture, at least not in my experience.
there's no perfection really. Nobody flies perfectly. In
Mm,
fact, the Thunderbirds, I brought a Thunderbird in to speak at a board retreat I was doing one time. The guy commander of the Thunderbirds was here in Atlanta. And he said, when you see There's guys and they look like they're in perfect position. What you don't know is the wingman in there, he's flying his stick is moving and his throttle is moving like this. And of course, I knew that from flying. If you fly formation, the stick and throttles are moving like this all the time because you're always correcting back. You're sliding out 3 inches, you go back 3 inches. You slide out a foot, you go back a foot.
Mm,
When you first start teaching formation to students, they'll slide out 10 or 20 feet and have to correct back. And the quicker you correct back, the smaller the correction is. But
mm.
anyway, it was we always had to be open to correcting back on course.
Yeah. Yeah. So you said no stateside posting. You finished your training and went straight to Southeast Asia?
Yes, I did. Shortly thereafter, I took a little week off, went back home, saw a couple old girlfriends, said goodbye. I was still single,
Mm-hmm.
and headed over there. And we stopped in the Philippines to go through a week of jungle survival.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, we went to Vietnam. And I'll tell you, got there in July, at the end of the first week of July to Vietnam. Of course, when we got to the
67.
Philippines, it was, yeah, 67.
Okay.
We got to the Philippines, it was hot and muggy. But when we got to Vietnam, it was just hot and muggy. And uh, it would be 100 degrees at 10 o'clock at night. you know, and muggy. So it was like anybody who from this country who goes to a country like that and steps out, it's like whoo, when you step off the airplane, it just hits you. It's amazing. Now you kind of get used to it after a while, but it was hot and muggy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even, I know you grew up in Georgia. I grew up in South Carolina. We know hot and muggy,
Yeah, that's
but
right.
not like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else do you remember about arriving there? Just first impressions?
Um, I was focused. We were focused on our training because we knew it was preparing us for war. But at Clark Air Base, it was the largest base in Asia, military base, and it was the hub for all the traffic going east and west to Japan, Korea, and especially Southeast Asia, where the war was going on. So the officers club there at Clark Air Base, it had about 6 restaurants. There were, and probably 4 of them were open 24 hours a day because people come in at any time, because coming in from the US, you're 12 hours off, and people come in anytime, and they had probably 3 or 4 that had every night they had a group in there singing. One group was more formal dinner banquet hall type dinner hall, and they had an orchestra there. And
Hmm.
the Philippines were wonderful musicians. They could sing every American song you've ever heard, and you couldn't tell it wasn't the real singers. I'm telling you, they were good. They still are good. The
Yeah.
Filipinos are good. And so, but a lot of the bars would stay open 24 hours a day, and there'd be entertainers there every evening. So it was a good thing. And you'd see guys who were on R&R coming through, going somewhere or going home, and they would tell you what they'd been through, and you think, okay, okay, okay. And then after that one week, we got in an airplane and flew over to Vietnam.
Yeah. And what do you remember about that? That's what I mean. When you arrived in Vietnam in July of 67, you talked about the heat, the humidity.
I got
What else made an impression on you?
I was going to Da Nang. I got there in the afternoon. They told me I would be sleeping in a they had the pilots, we had air conditioned rooms. We were the only ones on base that had air conditioned rooms to sleep in because we were flying 24 hours a day. We had 8-hour shifts. And so you'd fly one week, you'd fly early evening, one week late evening and early morning, and the other one you'd go from like 10 o'clock until 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So you'd fly daytime mainly. So we had air conditioned, but I went into a trailer. They had some 4-level uh, buildings there to sleep in, small rooms, but I temporarily they put me and another guy in a little uh, trailer, and we were on one end, there 2 guys on the other end of that trailer. So anyway, but no, that first night we were in a big open barracks without a air conditioning. That's what the first couple of nights we didn't get in a room yet. And at 12:25 that evening, the rockets started coming in. And every 2 or 3 months, the North Vietnamese people would sneak in and get close within 3 or 4 miles of the base and launch some rockets onto the base. And it blew up several airplanes that night. It killed 2 or 3 people. And when I heard that rocket go off, I'd just gone to bed about 12 o'clock because we'd been down to the bar and had a couple of drinks and learned what was happening there. When that rocket went off, my buddy and I was up top and he was in the bottom of that bunk bed. We climbed down and got under the beds there on the floor to protect ourselves. And I thought, man, if it's going to be like this every day, this is going to be hell, you know. But it
Mhm.
was they would rocket us about every 2 or 3 months.
How soon did you start flying missions?
A couple of days later.
A couple of days later.
We
Wow.
had to go through some ground training and learn how the operation was going, what the procedures were, and all that. And then flew our first flight, and we would fly with someone who's the Air Force has 2 seats in it, two pilots. The Air Force had 2 pilots in theirs, and the Navy and Marine Corps had a pilot in the front seat and a radar intercept officer in the back seat. And the Air Force decided it could train more pilots, which it thought it would need for the war if they put pilots in the back seat. So those of us who had just graduated from undergraduate pilot training, who had just got our wings and become pilots, we were in the back seat. So for about a year, we're going to be in the back seat for about a year, and then they would upgrade us to the front. So I
So
was
you're in
in.
the back seat, but you're not a Rio. Help me understand that, because I made this mistake once before in an earlier episode where I didn't adequately distinguish between a pilot and a Rio. You're saying
Yeah.
in the Air Force the distinction is irrelevant.
No, that we had a distinction about 2 years later, we put Rios back there.
Okay.
But at that time, in 1964, and when the Air Force first got the F-4, starting in about 63, the Navy, it was a naval airplane. It was bought for the Navy, but the Secretary of Defense and the people said, Air Force, you got this airplane too. The Marine Corps had it, of course. And so we had it. But the Air Force decided we're going to put pilots in the back seat. They'll be
Mm,
like co-pilots or something.
okay.
Well, we went through the same combat training as the front seater. The difference was we did not have the capability in the back seat to push the button and fire the rockets or shoot the gun or drop the bombs.
Okay.
Otherwise, we could fly the airplane. And we didn't have the handle to raise and lower the landing gear.
Okay.
Everything else we could fly. So I would fly a lot of the times on those missions. I would fly probably 40% of the flight. And the front seater would be looking out, and sometimes they would even carry binoculars and look down at the ground, looking for targets in the
Mm,
ground, that
mm.
sort of thing, and navigation and whatever. And I would fly a good bit, and I made landings and sometimes did takeoff. But
So
we were in
how long did you continue doing that, flying in the back seat as a
until
co-pilot?
I got shot down and captured.
And how long was that?
uh, from July until November the 7th. But the deal was they had implemented is everybody goes over there, most everybody goes for 1 year. That's
Hmm.
what it was. If you're going to Vietnam, it's a 1 year trip. You go over there, the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force. Air Force pilots who flew only in South Vietnam had to stay there a year. If you flew over North Vietnam, because the risk of being shot down and captured or shot down and killed were so high, they've set an example, they set a number. If you fly 100 missions over North Vietnam, you can go home. And so some of the bomber pilots that flew there every day, and that was the only place they ever flew, for them, it could be as short as 7 months. 8 months was about average, 7 or 8 months. For where I flew out of Da Nang, we flew some in Laos, we flew some in South Vietnam, close air support for the Marines and the Army. It was generally about 10 months.
Okay.
So I was headed toward about 10 months. But from July, let's see, August, September, October, November, 4 months, I had flown 53 missions over. I was on my 53rd one when I was shot down and captured.
And
I was halfway through.
what do you remember about that mission? Do you remember where you were, what
Oh,
your
I
objective
remember
was?
everything.
Yeah.
When you're a POW, you remember everything that's
Mm.
ever happened. Yeah. I that day I was on we're two ship, and we had bombs and rockets. Wingman had some rockets, but we were going up north to fly with a over. Uh, we're patrolling the southern part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail as it came toward the DMZ, and then it turned west. It didn't cross the DMZ because they couldn't. It would go over into Laos and then go south again and come in from the side angle of South Vietnam, where we didn't have a DMZ. And we didn't, it was so long, hundreds of miles long, we didn't have enough people to block them from coming in. So we would go up into Route Package 1, which was the southern part of North Vietnam, and patrol the Ho Chi Minh Trail and other trails that might be there and look for trucks and bomb them. I would bomb out bridges. If they built a bridge, we'd bomb it out. And a few weeks later, they might build it again. We'd bomb it out again. We'd also go after anti-aircraft artillery that was protecting those bridges. And they put in fords there, or not fords, but a boat that would carry the trucks across.
Ferries.
Ferries, yeah. They put in ferries there, and they would hide them in the daytime and bring them out at dark, and use the ferries to take the trucks going south across the ferry. And so we were always looking for those kind of things to bomb. So that day, we were working with a forward air controller, Mistyfac, with flying F-100s, and they would go up and patrol the roads down at 300 or 400 feet. They would go up and down the roads looking for trucks, and trucks would park in the trees sometimes too, and they would look for those, find them going into the trees, and bring us in to bomb. And so that day, the Mistyfac said, "Hey guys, I want you to bomb the anti-aircraft artillery that's protecting the ferry boats here. They're protecting where they cross. They're not here right now, but they protect them, and want you to bomb them and blow them up." So we were attacking those, and we came down, dropped the bombs, and about 2 to 3 seconds later, our airplane blew up, and it was tumbling end over end. It wasn't just normally an airplane gets hit, it gets a 37, 57 millimeter hole in the wing or in the fuel tank, and your fuel starts to go out. It hits the engine kind of goes out, but you keep flying for 30 seconds to maybe 30 minutes in order to fly back home and land and get back home. But this time, our airplane just blew up into several big pieces. Fortunately, the cockpit stayed intact, and we tumbled, and I was in negative G's all of a sudden at only about 5,000 feet. And I knew if I punched out with negative G's, my head would hit that canopy top and might really break my neck. And so I held off for a second, and all of a sudden it flipped and G's went positive, and I pulled that handle, ejected. It blew the canopy off. It blew me 50 feet in the air automatically, blew me 50 feet in the air. And then automatically the seat separator pushed me out of the seat. And when the seat separator pushes you out of the seat, it pulls the ripcord on your parachute so that it automatically opens your parachute. So I pulled the handle, and 2.6 seconds later, I'm looking up, checking my parachute. Over enemy territory, and all this shooting on the ground, shooting at our wingman, shooting at the Mistyfac, maybe shooting at us. I can see the bullets going by, the tracers going by, and I can hear all this stuff. But I was well trained, and all I'm thinking about is, how can I slip my parachute to that river right over there, because we're only a mile and a half from the ocean. And if I slip my parachute to that river, I can land in the river and maybe get out there, and the Navy will pick me up. But those parachutes back then didn't slip much. So I did my parachute landing fall. I hit all 5 points and did a perfect landing fall. And then I jumped in an old bomb crater there, and disconnected my parachute, pulled out my emergency radio, and I said, "This is Buckshot 2 Bravo. I'm on the ground. I'm 200 meters north of the river. Start shooting at 300, strafe them. I'm headed south." 7 years later, I was at a reunion 2 years after I came home, and the guy, my wingman, my flight lead, actually came over and said, "Hey, I heard your call. I'm sorry I was afraid I couldn't shoot that good. I didn't want to hit you." I said, "You were very wise. They captured me within 90 seconds." So you couldn't have got it done.
They captured you within 90 seconds.
Yes. The militia was there and they just surrounded me.
Mm.
Yep. It was
Yeah.
quite an event.
Okay. So do you mind just describing a little bit the capture itself? I mean, how did
I got to dismiss that pop up there.
yeah, it's okay.
You know, the
I mean,
capture,
did you speak any Vietnamese? Did they speak any English? Like how did the whole transaction go down?
that's an interesting question. You've asked me about how did I get captured? You know, these militia guys were trained. They farmed and they were militia and their primary job was to shoot at us or capture any pilots that came down. And they surrounded me. At first, it was only three. I pulled up my 38 Smith and Wesson. I had 2 rounds of tracer and 3 rounds of ball, and I thought they trained us in survival training. These guys are the least trained about handling captures, so I thought maybe I can scare them off. I pulled out and fired around a tracer over a couple of them's head, and I yelled, "Get out!" I didn't try to shoot them. I just fired around a tracer over their head. They didn't flinch. They raised their AK-47, and one of them pulled out a little card out of his pocket. It was a little folded card, and he looked down at it and he yelled. It had on one side, it had a drawing that showed a pilot with his helmet on with his hands up, and on the other side, it had phonetic. And he says, hands up, hands up, surrender, no die, surrender, no die. And I thought, that's probably good advice. I better do that because by this time there's about 6 of them with AK-47s there. So I
Hmm.
put my hands up and they come in and captured me and took away all my stuff, my flight suit, my G suit, my G suit, my flight suit, my boots, everything, stripped me down to my jockey shorts and searched me, you know. And then they gave me my flight suit back, and that I was very calm and
You're not injured at all.
no. Well, I had a cut on my lip. I had a cut on the back of my head. I had 18 G's going up the ejection seat. My head, the next 2 days, my head, I couldn't raise my head much more than about that.
Mm.
But at that time, I felt no injury whatsoever.
Okay.
Okay. And but until that point, until I surrendered and they captured me, I was perfectly thinking about avoiding them and not being captured. Once they captured me, it was like, whoosh, now it's like, I don't know what's going to happen,
Mm.
you know? And I'm a person of strong faith. And when they didn't kill me right away and they tied my hands and put a blindfold on me and put a rope around my neck and started leading me around like a dog, I could see underneath that blindfold. I could see down where my feet were and where I was walking, but I couldn't really because they were pulling me along. And they took me on to a village over there, and it just most of the time I was blindfolded and kind of being dragged around, and uh, it took me 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, about 7 days to get to the holding point, which was en route to Hanoi. I was way south of Hanoi. Okay. And they had a kind of a holding pen up there near Ben, and where they would bring in POWs, and it was kind of like an old barn with little stalls in it, and they would put us in there, and we'd be tied up and blindfolded. And I waited there for only 2 days, and then they had 3 other guys there. When I came in 2 days later, we headed for Hanoi. But during that time period, you know, an amazing thing happened with my capture. And this didn't happen to almost anybody I know. But the guy who was in charge of taking me north, who was a militia guy from this little village where I was, he was a good man, a person of great character and integrity. Now, he worked for the communists because he didn't have a choice. He had to take me captive and take me north, so we'd go to Hanoi. But this guy protected me from all the villagers that would get all fired up by the communist party head in the village. He would get a walkie
A bullhorn?
a bullhorn out, and he would yell and get them all fired up about we got to win this war. Keep shooting them down, capture them, blah 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 blah, and how wonderful we are and how hateful they are. And I can see all that, but the people would get so fired up, they would come in there and try to smash my head and do everything like that. This guy had his troops protect me.
Mm.
He would push them back. They would get their rifles, AK-47s, and just push them back, and he'd throw me in a truck, in the back of a truck, and they'd drive off. And it was amazing. And the amazing thing is that a guy who lives nearby where I was captured, he was 5 years old when I was captured. He's now a friend of the Misty Facts, and they introduced me to him because they knew I was shot down there where he lived. And I've done Facebook video calls with him, and he went back and interviewed the widow of the guy that was in charge of me. And he said this guy had a great reputation. He became, the kind of the militia guy of the area, and he had a great reputation from being a person of great character. And he died in 2015.
Mm.
So he says, well, I remember him. She was speaking Vietnamese, but he was translating for me. He says, yes, I remember him being there. And she said he smiled some, and he had eyebrows that went all the way across. And she remembered me.
That's funny. So how long was the trip from the point of capture to Hanoi?
It took from the day I was captured, the 7th of November, I got to Hanoi on the 22nd of November.
And the whole time you're moving?
Actually, I spent, because a typhoon came in and the roads were washed out, and they didn't want to travel because we only traveled at night uh, because you get bombed out if you traveled in the daytime. And by the way, I got bombed several times by American F-105s and F-4s, but there were always foxholes and bomb shelters we jump into. And they
Mm.
pushed me down at a foxhole. I'd watch these guys come in and drop bombs and get out of my foxhole, and there's these big old red hot pieces of uh, shrapnel type stuff there. It was a wild trip, but they took care of me and moved me up there. But when that typhoon came in, he took me to his underground shelter, and I stayed 3 nights with his wife and daughter, 2-year-old daughter, and his father in this underground shelter. And he had the guards outside.
Yeah,
It was like an underground cave with a roof over it, and
sure.
we slept in there.
That's amazing.
Unreal, isn't it?
That's bordering on hospitality almost.
They treated me like I was a guest. Now I was tied up,
Yeah.
and to go to the bathroom, you had to go outside behind the tree out there, but the guard would take
Well,
me outside. But otherwise, they would sit around and try to talk to me, and they told me
isn't that
that
how, isn't
someday
that,
I would. They
isn't,
told me someday I would go home.
yeah. Okay. So roughly you said from the 7th to the 22nd, um, as you're moving from the point of capture to Hanoi, do you know where you're going? Do you know where they're taking
Oh
you?
yeah, oh yeah. Well, we figured they're going to take us to Hanoi. Yeah,
Mm.
we stopped there in Vinh, which was kind of the halfway house where they had the part-time prison to carry people from. And from there, we went straight to Hanoi. Now, we got from there, the last day or two of travel up to Hanoi, it was easy driving because they traveled in the daytime. And we were bombing the roads up there much less, not much at all. So we could speed along and race into Hanoi. And they got to Hanoi Hilton, and there it all started being locked up for years.
So this militia guy took you all the way there, took you all the way to the
Oh,
doorstep.
no, he just took me to Vin. He handed me over to the other group at Vin, which was only uh, partial. It took us a long time to get there, but it was
Gotcha.
only 200, 300, couple hundred miles.
Gotcha. Okay. So I'm just curious, like there was a point at which, you and he parted. And I just
Yeah,
wonder, I mean, you're enemies.
yeah.
You're his prisoner. He's your captor. But it hasn't been particularly brutal this journey together. Like,
No, it hadn't. He
how do you
protected.
say goodbye?
I think in the military and wartime, you have no problem with that. You're
Yeah.
doing your duty.
Right, but I'm saying when you parted, what was that like? I mean, did he wish you good luck? Did you, did you thank him for taking care of you? Like what? I don't
No,
understand.
no,
I don't
because
understand how I don't understand
I
how you
didn't
decouple
realize.
from an experience like that.
Yeah. No, I was just living minute to minute, and I didn't know that that was unusual. Well, I knew that me being over in his house was unusual.
Mm,
That was a God thing, it was
yeah.
incredible. Nobody else had that experience. No other POW had that experience. It was just unique, but it was actually, they had a Catholic church in his community. I've seen it since the war. I didn't know about it then, but there were uh, strong people of faith there in that community. But people who are of, other faiths also
Mm,
had respect for people too. So,
sure, sure.
you
So
know,
when you arrive in Hanoi, um, at the Hanoi Hilton, can you just kind of describe to me your first impressions? Like how many other prisoners do you see, or can you see any?
you
What was
can't
your
see any. I was put in a wash house, which is a small, uh, probably 7 feet by 7 feet brick wash house. They had about six back to back, three back to back with three more in the center courtyard of the part of the Hanoi Hilton, which we call Little Vegas at that time. Uh, that was a part where the Americans were kept. And in there, I was handcuffed and in leg irons and blindfolded. I got there about 11 or 12 o'clock, and that's where I was until about 5 o'clock. They came in and they had a pair of black pajamas and a pair of shorts and a black t-shirt, a striped shorts, and actually striped shorts, striped t-shirt, and pair of rubber tire sandals. They were chopped up out of rubber and made into tire sandals, like sandals. And the guy said, you know, pointed over to the water and had a pipe there and had a plug in. You pull out the plug and the water would run out. And he gave me a little towel about that big and said, bathe up. And I hadn't bathed in 2 weeks. So I bathed up and it was November. So believe it or not, it was probably, it was getting dark there about 6:30 or 7 maybe, but uh, it was probably in the low 60s, I'm guessing. And it felt pretty chilly, when you're pouring cold water on you in the low 60s. So I was a little bit cold, but I was glad to get the shower and put on my pajamas. And then they came back in and put me in handcuffs and they didn't put me in blindfold anymore, took me to a interrogation cell room, not a cell, but a room, small room. And in that cell, a room, there were three guys already sitting on little stools, and they were in handcuffs. And behind that table, there was a table. There was one guy sitting like this in a very nice dress uniform, and two guys without a jacket, dress jacket on beside them, but just in a shirt and pants. And they were the English speaking guys who were the uh, kind of the people who were the door openers and take you out and in and out, the shuttle people who would take you out to get your food twice a day. They were sitting on either side. And this guy, after I sat down, he looked around at the four of us. There's three plus me. One of them is the guy I was flying with when I was shot down.
Oh,
And
he's there.
yeah, now we rode the truck from Vien up to Hanoi. So I'd seen him
Okay. Okay.
bouncing along for 3 days. But we're sitting there, and this English speaker, uh, he put his hands like this. He leaned over. He said, "And now the fat is in the fire." I almost broke out laughing. If I hadn't been knowing I was in the Hanoi POW camp, I would have laughed in his face because it was so funny.
Yeah.
And now the fat is in the fire. Well, this guy was always memorizing English idioms.
From movies.
Yeah, and he would throw them out every time he could. And
Uh-huh.
so the fat's in the fire. And I thought, well, that was an old saying down south. That means you're burning, something's going to
Right.
happen. It's not a good thing when the fat's in the fire, buddy. So Anyway, we sat there and listened, and he told us you must obey all the camp regulations. All the camp regulations were posted. You can't talk to you can't talk loudly. You got to whisper in your room. You can't talk loudly. You can't talk to any other cell. You can't make noises. You can't ever escape. You'll be, whatever, all this kind of stuff. Followed the camp rules and they were posted on the back of the cell door. So we went to a cell after a few minutes that was 6.5 by 7 feet. Now that's about the size of a bathroom in a gas station in a small place out in the country, But there were 4 of us in there for the next 8 months, 24 hours a day, except when you're being interrogated or when we go to the wash house most days of the week, 5 days a week, and have about 10 minutes to wash off and wash our clothes off and that sort of thing. And we got fed twice a day, about 9 in the morning, about 4 in the afternoon. We were fed 6 months of thin, watery pumpkin soup with a piece of pig fat in it, 3 months of chopped up cabbage soup, and 3 months of what we call sewer green soup. Sewer greens were like chopped up lily pads, and they'd always have some pig fat in them, or maybe some monkey or something ground up a little bit in there. You didn't know what was in there, but there was almost no protein. But each meal we would get a small baguette of bread. Now that bread was about 10% protein. That's where we got our protein. We all lost weight, but we survived. And then occasionally they would give you a side dish. Generally, they give you a little side dish of stewed pumpkins, stewed cabbage, or stewed sewer greens, and it might occasionally have one little scoop of pork or sausage or something like that on it. A piece of meat about that size, but not most of the time. We didn't get that, but occasionally. But the amazing thing was that after settling, our bodies kind of settled into that, we did pretty well.
And so it went for what, 5 years?
Yep. Now, after 1969, because of what the wives back home did, and we haven't talked about that, but after 68, now first POWs got there, Alvarez, August 64, and then the second ones came in early January, February, March 65, and a good many in the summer and fall of 65, and then 66, a good many more. And then by the summer of 67, the fall of 67, when I was captured, a lot of guys were shot down and captured because they had a lot of anti-aircraft artillery and surface-to-air missiles. They were shooting down a lot of us. So our odds of getting shot down were pretty high up there by 66 and 67.
So how many guys do you think are in there when you get there?
By the time I got there were over probably 240. So we had the bombing stopped in the summer of 68. I got there in November 67. The bombing stopped up there in the late summer of 68. And so we didn't have any more for 3.5 years. POWs in our system up there.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had about 360 guys that were POWs for 5 to 8 years. Then we didn't have any again for 3.5 years, and there are about 140 or 50 that were there from 12 to 14 months to 2 months, 3 months.
Mm-hmm. So you said once you got used to the new routine and the new diet, you guys, for the most part, did okay physically. I assume you mean physically. What about otherwise?
Well, we would have things physically, just about physically. There was a time when things would go through the camp, and everybody would get sick with the flu, and for a week or so, and you'd recover. And then one time everybody got the chicken pox or something and recovered. And the thing where you can't see, I've forgotten, as a kid, we all had that that, but about half my group had that when I didn't have it. But you just kind of work through it and survive. And the good thing was, if you were in a cell with one or two people, that was a whole lot better than being by yourself. And then later, after what the wives did back home in 69, especially, they stopped the torture. And then we got a lot healthier, emotionally, mentally healthier. We can talk about that. And after the Sante raid in November of 70, we were moved back to Hanoi. Many of us were in other camps. We all went back to Hanoi to camps where the Vietnamese had been, and they moved them out and they put us in big cells with probably 1,800, 2,000 square feet with 40 to 60 guys. I went in a cell with about 53 guys for a year and a half.
Yeah,
And that,
one of the things that really struck me about your book, and I love these historical highlights that show up in between chapters. I didn't realize that it just hadn't occurred to me how spending that last year and a half in a group of 30 or 40 must have been therapeutic in a way that, I mean,
yeah,
in terms of easing your transition back into the world later.
it was. It was incredibly healthy. We got so much healthier. That's why one of the reasons I was able to write this book, Captured by Love, Inspiring True Romance Stories from Vietnam POWs, because the POWs came home very, very emotionally healthy. We would have been a mess if we'd come home in 1969 when the torture was still going on, the summer of 69. People tortured going on in every camp up there. They were actually torturing guys to sign a statement saying they'd received good treatment because the wives back home, the Geneva Accords, which they had signed, Geneva Conventions, they had signed, the North Vietnamese communists had signed, said that they would treat captured prisoners lenient and humanely. Well, they had torturing guys to sign statements, one-page statements, said they'd received lenient, humane treatment. And of course, we refused, and they tortured guys to do that. Well, that's what was happening. But because of what the wives did, and Ho Chi Minh died, they stopped the torture. They were getting international pressure by now about their treatment of us, and they stopped the torture. And then the Sante raid of the fall of 70, they got scared that they were going to raid other camps, and so they put us back to Hanoi in those big cells. And there, you have to be authentic. You can't pretend when you're in a room of 40 or 50 guys, everybody's going to see who you are. And that we were all accepted. And
Mm.
so we became very united, very caring for each other. It was a fantastic community. We had classes. We got organized. Our senior leader brought in a guy who had been a teacher at a community college and said, Tom Story, you're in charge of putting together an education program for this cell. Tom put together, he took a survey, he took a piece of brick chalk, brick tile, and it was like chalk, orange brick tile off the roof that had fallen off, and took a piece of that and went back on the concrete slab floor around the outside and wrote a list of things. That evening, we had 2 minutes of silence every day about 6 p.m.
Mm.
He had announcements, and he announced, guys, I have made a list of things that we can study in here. Go by and just put a mark on. We'll do a survey. He did the survey. And then we started Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday classes, 3 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon. And because I had had 4 quarters of French in Georgia and was the worst French student ever been there, I taught beginning French, but
Ah,
I took intermediate French from a guy who was pretty good at it. But I studied beginning German, beginning Spanish. My goal was to get fluent in Spanish and French and have a 2,000 word vocabulary in German before I went home. Unfortunately, I was there long enough to do that.
yeah.
And so
You
we
guys
would,
have a name for this school?
no, we didn't really have a name in ourselves for that school, but we would go to class for 8 weeks. And everybody didn't go, but most people did. They get in something. We had architecture. We had an architect in there. With 40 guys, most of them had college degrees. Some of them had master's degree.
Hmm.
Okay. with that many people, you got a lot of people that are pretty knowledgeable in one area. So we had plenty of teachers. We had people that taught art. We had people taught music. We had a great choir, and on Sundays we'd have church. And these old fighter pilots would get up and give a nice little sermon, and it was amazing what we did there, and working out. We had guys that could. I was walking on my hands, and I could walk across the back of the cell, which was maybe 30 or 40 feet on my hands. But we had one guy who was a gymnast. He could walk all the way down and all the way back, the long length of it, a couple of times on his hands without getting down. So we were all doing these physical. We were getting more food now in 1970, a little bit more food. So we were working out every day and doing push-ups and chin-ups. At another camp we had outside place where there was a beam across the top holding up the roof, and we could jump up and do chin-ups. And I started with 3, and a year and a half later, before we left, I could do 30 chin-ups and 15 pull-ups.
And speak 3 languages.
And yeah, well, 2 languages. I only had a 2,000 word vocabulary in German, but I could kind
That's
of
enough.
get around in it. Yeah.
Yeah. Most of us don't have, we have, huge vocabularies in English, but we use the same 2,000 words over and over and over.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And a guy spent a lot of times, it'd be quiet in there a lot of times too. And we'd had, after 9 o'clock every night, it got very quiet in there. Okay. And be quiet until about 6:30 the next morning. And everybody had a screen mosquito net to sleep under. So you could kind of get in your mosquito net. We had wires that pull them, and we could tie to these wires. We'd put up these wires and tie to them. And so we could kind of get in your own little world inside your mosquito net at night. And we would pray for hours and memorize poems. Oh, I didn't talk about that. We memorized these long poems, from famous poems. Some guys had Bible verses memorized. They'd share them. But what all this enabled us to do, we knew that if we came home in 1969, we had so much anger, bitterness, shame. If you've been tortured and you've given in, you have shame about that. And it helped because everybody around you has been tortured and given in and signed something they shouldn't have signed, or told them something they shouldn't have told them. It's usually lies. We lied on everything like that. And misled them. One guy was tortured to say who the 2 pilots in his squadron were that were against the war. Well, there was none. But he finally was tortured. He had to make up somebody. And so he said Clark Kent and Ben Casey, Clark Kent was Superman. And
Ben
of course,
Casey was a
everybody in
doctor.
America knew that he was tortured because Clark Kent, Ben Casey was on TV. So,
Right. Right.
we always tried to outsmart them.
Mm.
But there was shame even to do that. There was shame about not being tough enough to beat them. So and the loss of our, families doing without us back home, all the worry about that and everything. So we had to get healthy, and we did. Our PTSD rate is much lower than the combat veterans who fought for a year in the South. And we were there 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And we went through torture. And for the first couple of years, some guys were in 4, 5 years of torture almost. So not every day, but it happened in their camp and to them several times. So we were just getting healthy to come home, and that made all the difference in the world.
Now, are you guys getting,
day by day, we were working at getting healthier day by day.
Are you receiving mail or news from home at all? Is there any correspondence?
A few guys, they let a few guys write home because they had a reason to do that. They could say that, but most of us didn't until I'd been there 2 years. December of 1969, I got to write a 6-line letter home, and my parents got it a few months later. They would save it back and then mail it. And I got my first 6-line letter, or little note letter, in the summer of 1970. I'd been there 2.5 years. So I would get 2 or 3 two or three letters a year, and I would get to write 3 or 4 letters a year. So that's what it was like. So the only really thing we learned from each other was that we're doing okay. Otherwise, there wasn't any real message in there.
But now you're single.
Yeah,
Some of the guys you're imprisoned with are not single.
yeah.
Um,
Most of them were
they,
married. Yeah,
they're not getting any news from home at all. They don't have any idea what, whether
not
they're,
much, not much.
so they don't know what's waiting for them when they get out of there.
Well, in a couple of them, I'd say about of the married guys, probably 40 to 45, 50% of them were divorced when they came home. Their wives said, I'm out of here. And some of them went to Mexico. But that was the national average, about the same as the national average when we came home in 1973.
I'm sorry, what was the Mexico reference? That some of them went to you, oh, because you
Some of
could
the
get a
wives
quick
went to
divorce.
Mexico, divorced, and remarried.
Ah,
They got a
gotcha.
Mexican divorce. They could legally say they were divorced.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but think about it. Some of these guys were gone 6, 7 years, and maybe their marriages weren't that great when they left. And some of the wives just got tired of being alone. They were raising kids.
Well, and some of them might not have known even whether the man was
No,
alive or not.
some of them did not know for 3, 4, 5 years that their husband was still alive, and some didn't know for sure even until they came home. They kind of knew they were because the peacemakers that went over there, the peace folks that went over, some of the Hollywood stars and famous people that went over, uh, they were told about some of the people that were alive, and the husband, they actually saw some of the people, and the guy said, "Tell my wife I'm alive," and they actually did that when they came back home. So that's when some of the wives, but they weren't sure that that was true,
Hmm.
and so they waited till they got a letter. And we have stories like that. We have um, uh, Wes Shireman, his wife Faye did not know for sure from our government until 4.5 years after he was shot down.
So what did they tell her? That he was missing? Did they tell her he was missing and presumed dead? Did they tell her, I mean,
Missing in action.
that's
Missing.
it. That's all we know.
They were missing in action unless they knew they were a POW or they knew they were killed in action.
Hmm.
Otherwise, they were missing in action. And so I was MIA, even though I'd made a radio call, and the the government told my parents that I was alive on the ground. I'd made a radio call. They told her exactly what I'd said, and that they had no more information about me, but I was probably alive. But by I don't know exactly when they found out for sure that I was alive, but they did when 2.5 years later when they got that letter.
Hmm.
But I think they probably knew it from the government before then.
So you guys had this time to do this sort of, collective healing. Um, it's to me, it's just remarkable evidence of what social creatures we are.
Yeah,
And so by the time you're released and you return home, a lot of the stuff that you would have to go through mentally and emotionally in terms of transitioning, you've already done.
yeah, exactly. We're just like, okay, what? Let's go. Let's look around and discover what's happening here. You
Yeah.
know, it was
So
amazing how
how was
well
that for you? Who were the
we
first people you saw when you got home?
Well, we were all able to call home we went back to Clark Air Base, where they had the largest hospital in the Far East. That's where all Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, we all went through Clark Air Base Hospital.
Hmm.
Most of us stayed there 2 days, and then we went home, but we got a called home. We got a full physical. We got a new uniform. We talked to our families, and one of the stories in the book, the guy, when he first met his wife, had dated a lot. He met her and they were on a second or third date or something. And he dated so many girls, and he was introducing her, and he introduced her as Jane, and her name was Louise. Now, this was the guy that brought the tap code in, who was a POW almost 8 years. And he introduced her as Jane, and she looked over at him and says, "Well, Tarzan," like, my name is not Jane. Well, when he called her, he'd been not talked to her in almost 8 years. She was had two little girls. She was raised without him, and she was 8 months pregnant when he was captured, shot down, and she didn't know for a long time whether he was alive or not. Eventually, he got to write a letter home, but she had a son a month after he was captured. He had never seen. She raised these kids. He calls her home and he said, "Hello, Jane. This is Tarzan." She said, their story's in the book. She said, "I knew right then he was going to be okay and we were going to have a good marriage."
Hmm.
And they have had one of the best marriages ever. They've been married. He's 94. She's about 86 or 87. She was a flight attendant, stewardess back then, a flight attendant. And they just have a wonderful family, and they have great grandchildren now. People come, their families, grandchildren are close by. One of them is an Air Force pilot now, but otherwise, close
Yeah.
by.
Well, one of the things I really like about the book, and aside from the the historical highlights, which, it's almost like you put those in there just for me. Like I just, I can't get enough of that stuff.
Yeah.
But the other thing I love about the book is just the variety, the different kinds of stories, right? Guys who were married when they were captured, who came home and, the marriage worked. Guys who were married when they were captured, they came home and that marriage didn't work, but the next one did. Guys
Mhm.
like you who were single when they were captured and I mean, you guys, I think the point of the book is that you came home kind of ready for healthy relationships. Like mentally and emotionally, you guys were stable enough and healed enough and had enough perspective that you could make a relationship work, even if it wasn't the one that you were in when you left. Um,
Yeah.
but what surprises me is how many different flavors of that you managed to capture.
Yeah. And, it just kind of worked out that way. But at our reunions, I'd written several books. I've written two leadership books based on leadership lessons from the Hanoi Hilton, because I've had a leadership consulting company for 27 years. And
Mm.
so each one of those chapters has, here's the story from the Hilton about the leadership lesson, how it applied from the POW camp, and then transition, here's how it's being applied in today's workplace, and then some coaching at the back of the chapter. But I kept hearing all these stories at our reunions about the couples, and I'd heard about the wives and hadn't met some of them until we had our reunions. And I got to know them, and I saw how outstanding their marriages were and how their families were so healthy and all. And I said, Hollywood couldn't write a script this crazy. Nobody would believe Hollywood writing a script this crazy. Somebody needs to write a book about this.
Hmm.
And finally, I said, I guess I better do it. So a friend of mine who was a speaker and author also said, you need to bring in a guy who's a romance writer, Greg Godak. He's written a book, 1001 Ways to Be Romantic. It's a bestseller. And you need to bring him in to help you with this book. And I said, that's a great idea. So I did.
Yeah, that's a little different than a romance writer. He bills himself on your cover as a love expert. So he's
Yeah.
more of a therapist, really, right?
Yeah, he is. He is.
Yeah.
Really is. And so we were able to interview these people, and then he would kind of help me put that together. He would take it over and kind of draft it, and I would get the historical part right in it, and he
Hmm.
would work on getting the romance right and work with these couples to get the love lessons. And so each story has love lessons. At the end of each chapter, there's two or three love lessons, and then I
Hmm.
summarize them all at the back. And I
Hmm.
worked on the historical highlights. There's a 1 page or 2 page historical highlight between each chapter, and half of those are from what was happening in the POW camp, and half of them are what was happening back home with the wives and widows, who some of them were widows. They didn't know they were going to be a widow.
Right.
Two stories of ladies who were widows who came home when their husbands didn't come home. They actually met a fighter pilot. One was divorced. His wife said, I'm out of here. She married a widow. And another one was a guy who came home and his wife had passed away while he was a POW. She had a terminal illness and they were best friends. her husband and him were best friends, and his wife and her, this widow, were best friends. And he went to see her, and a couple of months later, he proposed, and a few months later, they got married. And they were married until both of them passed away in their 80s, but they were married for over 40 years. So, it was amazing how incredibly strong those people who were divorced when they came home by their wives met somebody within a few months that was a perfect companion and had the same values. And they've been married for 48, 49, or 50 years. Uh, the single guys, I dated a lot of girls for a year when I came home until I met the one, and that's the title of my story.
Chapter 20.
I knew that I'd met the one, and right away, and she knew that I was the one, and so we just dated, and right, it was pretty obvious. We told our families, "Hey, I think I met the one. This is the one," and so I went and met her family. She went and met my family, and we got married pretty quickly, and we'll be married. Well, we met 50 years ago this summer, and we got married 50 years ago next December. So we just had our 49th anniversary.
How about that? Wow.
Amazing.
Congratulations, man. So, yeah, so as you said, you tell the 20 or so of these stories, all different flavors of coming home from that POW experience and then making a relationship last for decades, right? And
Yeah.
then after each one, you've teased out what you think are the lessons for us all to learn from that example. When
Mhm.
you look at the kind of all those lessons all up, in summary, are there any that surprised you?
What surprised me is what made those marriages work were the same things that are important in a lot of places. They're just more important there, like respect, trust, commitment, companionship. Uh, those things are so important. Romance is really important when you're dating and you're first married. But within 2 years, that all settles out. You won't have to work at it and keep romancing going, over the long years. But what settles out is your your respect for each other, your value for each other, your commitment to each other, and your companionship. And those things are important at work. Commitment, values, trust, those things are important everywhere in relationships. And so that was what surprised me is, yes, romance gets you started and you need to keep it going. You need to work at it, keep it going and be thoughtful about how to be romantic. But ultimately, to keep people in a marriage long term, they have to uh, share this closeness that can only happen when you really respect this person and you have the same values and you enjoy their companionship, you know?
Mm.
And so those are the key things that make a good marriage. But I think that commitment thing is so important too. We were committed in the POW camp to our country. We suffered torture to keep up, to live by the 6 articles of the Code of Conduct, which says basically I'll resist the enemy. I will not help them make propaganda and all that stuff. I'll be faithful to my country. I'll be faithful to my teammates. If you're senior, you'll take command. If you're not, you'll obey the orders of the commander over you. That's what those 6 articles are. And our commitment was so strong that we would take torture almost to dying. They wouldn't let you die to keep up with that. So return with honor was our goal. And honor is important everywhere, especially in marriages.
Mm. Is there a, I mean, it's a bit like asking you what's your favorite child, which one's your favorite child? But is there a story aside from your own in this book that sort of comes to the top of your mind more often than the others?
They're all so unique, but let me share a couple of them that are very different right quick.
Okay.
One gal was married to this wonderful fighter pilot, Naval Academy graduate. And on his second tour in Vietnam, he went down and didn't come home. She raised two kids, strong faith, strong person. She got involved in the National League of POWMI family. She went to Paris to help confront the communists from North Vietnam at the Paris peace talks. She was so strong and all that. And her husband did not come home. He was declared KI, killed in action. When we came home, he didn't come home. And she was so discouraged. And so she was there living in the town near the Navy base. And so one Sunday, she gets a call from a guy who sounded kind of simple and quiet. And he said, and she almost didn't answer the phone, but she answered the phone and she said, are you Dora Bell? And she said, yeah, are you Dora, the first name? What? She said, yes. He says, well, I'm Jim Bell. I was a friend of your husband. We were both RA-5 vigilante pilots, and I was a POW 7.5 years. I went down after he did, but I was your friend, and I knew him pretty well, and we've met before, and we're having a party a little with my old friends over here at the Officers Club. We're having lunch. Would you come join us? And she said, yeah. And they started dating and just spending time together. But when he came home, his wife had divorced him and he was so sad. And when we came home, her husband didn't come home and they started connecting because they were both so sad about their loss in their loved one. And a few months later, they were married and they were married for over 40 years. And it was just an incredible story. They were both of her husbands were Naval Academy graduates, by the way, and they'd known each other. Another story was a guy who's a single guy, and he thought about strong Christian guy. He thought about the gal he was going to meet and marry. He was going to come home and date for a year and not marry anybody for a year because he needed some dating time because he was 24, 25 when he got captured.
Mm-hmm.
And
Play the field.
so he came home, and there was a widow in Montgomery, Alabama, who was Jewish and married to a fine Jewish doctor, died. She had two kids. Her friend husband was a POW, MIA, and then POW. And so she wore a bracelet. She helped sell bracelets and everything.
Mm.
So when her friend's husband came home to Montgomery, she went over and was up on the tower on a high place watching these single guys and married guys come off the airplane when they first got home. And she saw her friend run out and hug her husband. And then this single guy got off and said, I'm so thankful to all you all. I'm so glad to be home. Appreciate what you've done. And now I'm ready to meet some nice girls. She heard him say that. Well, the next week, her friend said, hey, this guy who's single here, you ought to meet. He's a friend of my husband's. You ought to meet him. And so she arranged a date with him. Well, 3 weeks later, we all went to the White House. President Nixon invited all the POWs to bring one guest and come to the White House for the largest banquet ever held at the White House. We went up there on May the 24th, 1973. He proposed to her in the Blue Room at 2 o'clock in the morning. They have one of the greatest marriages I've ever seen.
Still going.
Still going. He's 83, 84, and she's 81 or 2. And they've just had a wonderful family, close friends. He became a doctor. He went to medical school, became a flight surgeon for the Air Force after we came home. Brilliant guy. He became requalified in pilots, was a top gun in the A-10 airplane in his squadron. Also, at the same time, he was a flight surgeon.
Yeah.
Amazing guy. He was a head flight surgeon for Combat Air Command when he retired. So just amazing stories that here's this, and they've had a wonderful family. He was Christian, she was Jewish, and they've just had their faith overlaps, and they've just made it work in a wonderful way.
So neither of them converted.
No, but when I go to their house, we always have a blessing before we eat. So,
Yeah.
oh, it's just they just have, God is love, and love conquers all.
Mm,
In the POW camp, we go back to Vietnam now, and we love Vietnamese people. Vietnamese people come here. We love Vietnamese people.
mhm.
It was a communist thing of living by lies that was the problem that made us fight each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you said that you had written a couple of books on leadership
Hmm.
for before you wrote this book. Um, so by then you had a reputation as an author of books about leadership, as a speaker, as a coach,
Hmm.
all about leadership, right? And that kind of makes sense. Like you think about that POW experience and what you bring home from that and what's worth sharing. Seems like, I don't think anybody would be surprised to learn that a Vietnam POW came home and became a leadership expert. How surprised were people about this book? Uh, what sort of reaction did you get as you started to tell people, friends and family, that this was your next project?
Uh, those who knew POWs thought it was a great idea because they knew there was some amazing stories. That so many guys, another guy who was a Navy fighter pilot came home. He didn't have any children. His wife said, "I'm out of here," and he was at a big event. Bob Hope was MC, and Ross Perot threw this big event in Dallas, Texas, right after we came home. And he was sitting with a date, just a person date, and there was this lady sitting beside him with a person date, and Tony Orlando's on stage with Bob Hope in the Cotton Bowl singing for us the Yellow Ribbon song. And he
Mm-hmm.
looked over, and she's got tears coming down out of her eyes. She's a widow. Her husband didn't come home. Her mother told her to come.
Mm-hmm.
And she has a son. He looks over and he puts his hand on her shoulder and leans over and gives her a kiss on the cheek. 7 months later, they were married and they've just had a wonderful marriage. But so, the POWs, all of us who know each other, we weren't surprised because we knew these marriage stories are just amazing. And the commitment and the long termness of it. We've had almost no divorces of POWs after we came home, you know other than the first 6 months or a year. Other than that, those left over, but no divorces. So that was one thing. And then other people, guys, if I have a book sale and I have my leadership books, leadership lessons, leading with honor, leadership lessons from the Hanoi Hilton, and the Captured by Love book, guys are going to buy the leadership book 8 times out of 10 because
Yeah.
they're romance. But guys, when they read the book, God say, I was laughing on one page and I had a tear on the next. So guys have really enjoyed the book, but women really like the romance books. But I think the thing about this book is that we need today is resilience. Resilience is so important in our culture today because young people and adults too are having problems with resilience, and that's the biggest problem in our culture psychologically. Resilience is there. You can bounce back. Um, and romance and turning into long-term commitment. Divorce is just right and left. People just say, I don't like this one. Whereas I think if you read these stories here, you'll see what it takes to have a real good marriage. And you'll think, well, that's the kind of thing I want. I got to find somebody who's willing to commit to that also. But, one of the stories in there is called Independent and Interdependent. And that's what's so important is that couples have to be independent. You cannot make somebody like you. I tried to make my wife, my first part of my marriage, I thought she was going to be like me. Well, she's not. She's my total opposite. But I let her be now. She's independent. I'm independent, but we are very interdependent.
Mm-hmm.
And when you can do that, that's the healthy thing to do.
Mm-hmm. So the book's been out now. I believe it came out, what, fall of 2023?
May of 2023.
Was it May? Okay. Okay.
I think it was about, it was Memorial Day week, the
Oh,
30th
okay.
of
Yeah, I
May,
thought, sorry,
31st
I
of
had
May.
it for some
Yeah.
reason it was connected in my mind to Veterans Day. Yeah, it was Memorial Day. So, uh, are you promoting it in any way that you'd like to talk about? I mean, where can people, first of all, where can people find it? And secondly, um, do you have events or anything like that coming up that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I think the best way to find out about the book is if you go to powromance.com. That's real simple, powromance.com, and you can download the first 50 pages, which is the first two stories of the book, and you can see the table of contents. And by the way, this book was endorsed. The endorsers of the foreword was written by Tony Orlando and Gary Sinise. You
Hmm.
know, heard of Lieutenant Dan and the Lieutenant Dan Band and Gary Sinise.
Yeah.
Gary's a friend of mine, and he's done so much for veterans. And Tony Orlando's been coming. He sang that night in the Cotton Bowl I mentioned, the Tie Yellow Ribbon song, which is about a guy coming home from prison jail here
Yeah.
in the U.S., but going home, and is his girl going to be waiting on him? And so that was the number one song when we came home.
Mm.
And so Tony Orlando's a good friend of comes to all our reunions. So but you know that uh, the book is coming along well. But if you go to POW Romance, you'll see a link to Amazon where it's on there, and the paperback version, which is this one,
Mhm.
the Kindle version, and the uh, audiobook, as well as Barnes and Noble and Books A Million. So all of those people have our book. So
Right.
there, but you can, and there's a link to couples, pictures of these couples, and there's a link to each of the 20 couples you can read about. You can read about history of the war, history of what the wives did. And I'll tell you,
Mhm.
wives back then, families stepped up, and the women were great leaders. They changed the policy of the US government and then changed the policy of the communist government to change our treatment. So they're the real heroes. What they went through back home was much worse than what we went through, you
Mm.
know.
So we're gonna publish this episode next week on Valentine's Day.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
Is there anything? I mean, no pressure, but if there's anything you'd like to say on just in terms of connecting this book with Valentine's Day, and just bearing in mind that most of our listeners are either Vietnam veterans or people who love Vietnam veterans.
You know, Valentine's Day, you see the symbol of the heart, and the heart is about the heart of individual. The heart is where we feel loved. Okay. And when you love somebody, when you really love them, you can be independent and interdependent. You don't try to change them. You accept them for who they are, and you want to do things for them to help them feel valued and important. Giving love. I coach leaders to give love. I don't talk about love. I talk about connection. Help them feel valued by affirming them, acknowledge their existence, appreciate them. Those kind of things, when you do that for another person, they're going to feel valuable, important. They're going to feel loved. So just smiling and complimenting somebody can be very, very helpful. This Valentine's Day, I want you to think about how you can make that other person feel special. Not just a box of candy that's shaped like a heart, but how can you connect with their heart to make them feel special? Quit judging them. Quit complaining on them about this or that and the other. Just let them be different. Hold them accountable for their values and doing the right thing. But otherwise, just let them know you appreciate them and look for ways that you can make them feel valuable and important. And their heart will be connected with every time you do that, 365 days a year. Happy Valentine's.